Good morning. We'll go ahead and start with a brief welcome while we let others join. Thank you all for being here this morning. My name is Kaylee Havens, and I'm one of the co-chairs for Georgia Legislative Day this year. As a reminder, Georgia Legislative Day will be virtual this year, and it will be hosted on Wednesday, February 3rd, with programming starting at 9 a.m. until about 12 p.m. Please make sure to register early for this event because we will be scheduling meetings with your elected officials following that 2 p.m. or 12 p.m. programming. So you'll want to make sure to put your home address so that we can actually schedule the appropriate elected official meetings. And we're excited to be offering the first of our 3 pre-event webinars this morning. You're about to hear from experts who have been working on amazing grassroots efforts for need-based financial aid here in Georgia. This coming Thursday, January 14th at 4:30 p.m., we'll have an immigration paralegal speaking on the topic of student protections in DACA. And then Thursday, January 28th at 2:30 p.m., you'll hear from David Hawkins with NACAC on our student to council ratios here in Georgia compared to other states in the U.S. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Ashley Young and Jesse Bowen to get started.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jesse Bowen. I'm a college counselor at Woodward Academy, and along with Ashley Young, we're happy to be talking to you guys today about need-based aid in Georgia and why we need, frankly, why we need need-based aid. We're going to talk today briefly about the history of aid when it comes to funding education in Georgia. And I think anytime you begin talking with Georgia legislators about scholarships or about funding for education and for college education in Georgia, the one thing that you're going to hear over and over again is what's on the next slide, Ashley, right? The next slide is, but Georgia has hope, right? This is almost the constant fallback anytime we talk about scholarship funding within the state of Georgia. The Hope Scholarship stands as a perfect example of funding for education for residents, and it's been held up as a model that other states have gone and adopted. As you know, the Hope Scholarship is a lottery-funded scholarship, and I want to begin by talking a little bit more about the history of the Hope Scholarship, just so that you have a better understanding of kind of the origins of the Hope, where it comes from, so that we can begin talking about other types of aid as well. So let's go ahead and begin, and we'll jump on into the next slide, Ashley. The brief history of Hope. If you didn't know already, Hope actually stands for something. The Hope Scholarship stands for Helping Outstanding Pupils Educationally. It began in 1991 under the leadership of Governor Zell Miller. And at that time, the Georgia Assembly designated Georgia lottery proceeds to go into educational funding. Now, on the next slide, you'll see that the actual funding for the scholarship was not fully established until 1993. 1993 was the year that the first Hope funds actually went out. And believe it or not, it actually went out to a student who was attending a 2-year institution at that time. When Hope was started, it was originally supposed to be a 2-year tuition stipend for students with a B average and a family income of less than $60,000 per year. So as you can see, the Hope Scholarship began with some sort of need-based requirements in mind. It was not for students whose families had a great deal of income. It was targeted for students that had less than $60,000. Next slide, please. Within a year, the Hope Scholarship began to evolve and change into the scholarship that we might recognize today. So after a year, it was changed from 2 years to 4 years. And then on the next slide, you'll see that within 2 years of its actual first payment, the income cap was completely abolished. Now, any resident in the state of Georgia could qualify for Hope regardless of family income. And so at that point, the Hope Scholarship went from being a merit-based scholarship with a need component to simply just being a merit-based scholarship. Next slide, please, Ashley. This is a quote from Governor Miller during one of his State of the State addresses when he was discussing the inception of the Hope Scholarship. And as you can see there, the point that I want to draw your attention to is the part there where he begins talking about how this is a scholarship that's not only for minority students or lower income families, but also middle income families who are devastated with the cost of education and training beyond high school. So I would argue that from the very beginning, Governor Miller had an intention of creating a scholarship that would help lower income to middle income families begin to cope with the rising cost of education in an effort to improve Georgia residents' education options throughout the state. Now, full confession, I'm originally from Athens, Georgia. I graduated from high school in 1998. And so I was a product of the student classes that were coming out right around the time that the Hope was coming into play and when it was beginning to evolve. And I'll be honest, the Hope Scholarship helped keep many Georgia residents in the state of Georgia. And that was one of its primary functions and primary intentions, was that it was targeted to keep Georgia's best and brightest in the state of Georgia. As you can see from this quote, it was also designed to help lower income, middle income families, give them more options to attend colleges and to better their educational opportunities. Next slide, please, Ashley. So here's roughly how the Hope Scholarship is intended to operate. Currently, as it stands, roughly a quarter out of every dollar spent on the Georgia lottery goes towards educational programs, whether that's pre-K or whether that's the Hope scholarships. Of that quarter, the remaining 60% of the dollars that are spent on lottery funds go towards prizes. 60% goes towards prizes, and an additional 16% goes towards the administration expenses. If we're going to take that quarter and break it down a little further, on the next slide, you'll see that that quarter percentage is roughly split into thirds. 1/3 of that fund goes towards pre-K spending, and an additional, the remaining 2/3 actually goes towards funding the Hope Scholarship programs, whether that's the Hope Scholarship, the Hope Grant, or the Zell Miller. As it currently stands, 2/3 of a quarter, so roughly about 16% on every dollar that's spent on the Georgia lottery goes towards funding the Hope Scholarship programs. In addition to the awards that are spent either on prizes or going out in the educational funds, the state requires that there be a reserve fund that's set separate from the Georgia State's General Reserve Fund. If you're familiar with the reserve fund, the General Reserve Fund goes towards fixing bridges, it goes towards repairing roads. It's kind of a large slush fund that the state can use towards any kind of repairs that it wants. The Hope Scholarship is also required to hold a reserve fund, which is critical towards paying out scholarships that last 4 years. They need to make sure that there's always an amount of money that resides in that reserve fund that can support the educational commitments that they've already made going forward. Next slide, please, Ashley. More recently, so the information I was giving you earlier talked about the origins of Hope back in the 90s. More recently, in 2011, the Georgia legislature restructured how that reserve worked. And it said that in order for the reserve to stay active, it needs to have at least 50% of the previous year's net proceeds. This is good fiscal sense. You need to make sure that every year there's more money in the reserves than was spent in the previous year. As we know, tuition at college institutions continues to increase. And so that the fund can continue to pay out scholarships and tuition fees over a 4-year period, there always needs to be more money than was spent in the previous year. However, the trouble with that is that that reserve continues to grow. By the end of the fiscal year of 2018, the shortfall reserve held $550 million in it. That shortfall reserve is the amount of money that is mandated by the state to be in there, to be able to fund the expenses that they've already committed to. An additional $619 million came into that reserve in the form of unrestricted reserves. Essentially, this is money that is in the reserve account that is in excess of what is legally required to be in there. So grand total in the reserve account, there's over $1.1 billion. And on the next slide, you'll see a graph that was produced by the Georgia Policy and Budget Initiative, GPBI. And in here, you can see that reserve currently stands at $1.28 billion. You can see in there that the 572 million, that's the funds that are required to be in there by state law, but $706 million are in there as unrestricted excess reserves. As I said, Hope Scholarship became kind of the archetype program, and many other states have created similar models to what we offer here in Georgia. What's different about Georgia is that in Georgia, this $706 million is just sitting in account. Basically, it's sitting in account, it's gaining interest. Every year, roughly about $14 million is coming back into that account, just based on interest, right? If you think about your personal savings account, every dollar that you put into the savings accounts ultimately results in getting you some money back at the end of the year. I don't know about your savings account, but mine, I generally get like 50 cents back, right? Well, on a much greater magnitude, this $706 million, or frankly, the $1.28 billion is resulting back in a return of $14 million every year. And that reserve is just continuing to grow. Other states are using that 706, the unrestricted excess reserves, to go towards many other educational projects, right? Tennessee uses their money differently. North Carolina has capital programs that are actually established to help improve schools, repair school buildings, improve pre-K programs. Tennessee uses that money to actually create need-based aid. And that's one of the areas that we are thinking that Georgia can do more with that money. So at this point, I'm going to hand things over to Ashley Young, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about the things that we can do and what we have been doing here in the state of Georgia.
All right, thank you, Jesse, so much for that history. Again, my name is Ashley Young, and I am a college counselor at Drew Charter School, and I am super excited to chat with you all this morning. We know that there are so many opportunities where us as educators who are practitioners on the ground every day that we can make a difference. And that's really what this presentation is about. And certainly the second half, we're going to give you tangible ways that you can speak to your legislators, to take on the mindset to sort of be in the space of how can, in this conversation, this short conversation, how can I drive home the importance of need-based aid for deserving Georgians? And so I do want to point out before I get started that Georgia is only one of two states that does not offer need-based aid. And so Jesse made some really great points in that there are other states with their unrestricted excess who are actually implementing a need-based aid program. We're just not doing that in Georgia. I believe the only other state is Vermont. It's a state up in the Northeast. I believe it's Vermont. But another way to put that is that we are like 49th or 50th in the nation for need-based aid, right? So these are just some ways to sort of to understand that. So what can we do? I'm super excited to share with you all in the next few moments about what we can do, because again, we are on the ground every day with students. As you work with students, as you get to know their story, you understand that there are many barriers to college and accessing post-secondary opportunities. And one of them we know is funding. So let's get into that. Let's talk a little bit more. It says here, what's happening in Georgia to solve this problem? So we at Georgia Legislative Day every year say, okay, these are our priorities, and generally one of the main priorities, of course, is need-based aid. But that looks different in Georgia. Why? Because we really, as a state, don't have need-based aid. We need more of it from a federal level, of course, but in Georgia, again, we don't have any at all. So we really want to motivate, as I say, put that fire in your belly to really gain understanding of why it is so important right here in the context of Georgia. So what are we doing? Coalition of Educators. So as you can see here, Jesse, Bowen, Yolanda Coleman, Anna Pless-Peel, Ashley Meyer, and myself, we're all just a group of folks, group of colleagues here in Atlanta. From our interaction through Legislative Day, just through SACAC, we have all expressed interest and have come together and said, hey, we want to do something different this year. We want to do something different. We want to make sure that even though these are our priorities and we hear them and we go to this annual day, what can we do beyond Legislative Day? And I'll give you a slight little background here. Around this time last year, I attended the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute conference. And when I found out that there was $706 million in unrestricted reserves and that there's 1.3 billion in general, or 1.1 around that figure, I was outraged. I couldn't believe that there was this much money sitting, and we are telling our students each year, right, that there's, perhaps not enough money, or having to listen to the stories with the parents who could not bridge the gap financially yet. In Georgia, we have $706 million sitting over the legal requirement. So with that fire in my belly, I began to put the word out, bringing on some really, really highly motivated educators who share the same passion. So we are getting together in our grassroots efforts, and just really taking time outside of our everyday work to really put towards moving the needle on need-based aid. So what have we been doing? Jesse has already illustrated this. We have been researching peer state need-based aid programs. What does that look like? Essentially, we are looking at peer states, right? Certainly, we wouldn't want to go get a model from California that might be quickly rejected in our current climate state legislature here in Georgia. So we're looking at Florida, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, looking at some peer states, and really finding out best practices. I think this is going to be a little bit more further down the road as we begin to make some traction, but we are just familiarizing ourselves with what are other states doing, what source are they pulling their need-based aid from, and it's generally their educational lottery, right? And how are they administering it? And they're just some really foundational ways that are just important as we're doing this work. What else are we doing to solve this problem? We are building key partnerships. So we cannot do this work alone, right? And so our role as college counselors, as everyday practitioners, as I've mentioned, our work is to see the challenges, right? We are with our students, we are supporting them throughout the college admission process, so we know what's going on. We see the typical case studies of a student with a particular academic background, and the colleges that they're choosing to attend, and we can kind of tell. I mean, obviously it's, every student is very unique and individualized, but once you start doing this work long enough, you can kind of predict what kind of financial aid package a student might get and where the challenge may be. And so we want to really emphasize that as college counselors, and high school counselors and college access educators and CBOs, I'm sure we have a ton represented here today, but we are on the ground, we see the story, so we know how to speak to our legislators about what's going on. So educators, us, we are super important, we are key. Policy analysts, so we need folks who are trained and are dedicated and can understand and have researched the history. So our team, our Coalition of Educators, we've taken some time to do that, but there's a lot to catch up on. So we need folks who are on the ground day to day, working to actually do the research on the policy in Georgia, helping us understand the history, helping us understand the context of the legislative seasons and sessions and what's been said about education policy. So our policy analysts are super crucial in this fight. Lobbyists, at the very beginning of this process, I have a good friend who is a lobbyist, and he came and he spoke to our group of educators. This gave us a ton of insight of what's happening downtown in the Gold Dome, if you will, right? Like, he was able to help us just talk about, how does a bill get passed? So I want to make it very clear, I do not have a formal legislative background. I am learning as I go. Google is my friend, but also, again, our key partners. So he, as a lobbyist who's working every day with legislators, was able to provide the information to us. And then, of course, legislators, knowing who your state rep is, knowing who your state senator is, knowing who's on what committees. And I'm sure our legislative day co-chairs will talk a little bit more about the importance of the committees as we go throughout this process. Excuse me. But knowing who's on the Senate Higher Education Committee, who's the chair, who's on the representative side, and what are they responsible for? And I'll talk about that in just a moment. This is so key. So knowing the legislators that are going to be pivotal players in this decision making is also important. So where are we? Current status. We are meeting with legislators. We are feeling our way around in the dark, quite frankly. Again, we aren't trained to do this. We just have a passion. We just have that fire in our belly. We just saw that stat and couldn't take it any longer, essentially. So we are sort of building the boat while we're on it, but we are learning so much, and we're excited to share these 5 tangible ways. So I really wanted to think of, Jesse and I wanted to think of some digestible key takeaways for you all. And so here they are. And once I conclude that portion, we'll take a couple questions. All right. Now, you all will be chatting with your legislators, and we want to make sure that the history that you've heard here today, the stats that you've heard here, that you can actually put them into play in conversation. So here are 5 ways that you can do that to illustrate the urgency of need-based aid. All right, the first thing we want you to do, and we are so thankful for our SACAC co-chairs for government relations, and also our team up at NACAC who helped make this possible. And we'll hopefully send this out, and I will certainly ask our co-chairs to send this out in the link as well. And if you are a member, you should have received this in an email by now, but we ask that you please sign the NACAC sponsored action alert. This is key as we engage with legislators, to be able to say, excuse me, that we have, 200 or 500 or 1,000 signatures of Georgians that agree that need-based aid is necessary. This is how we formalize. This is foundational to organizing, is to have those signatures. So please, please, please take about 30 seconds and add your information there. But this is a great way for us to speak about, again, what's happening, and then to also say, hey, we have these signatures and this support. So this is one key way that you can help us. All right. And then the next 2 points that I'm going to point out, I call these my elevator pitch moment, the friendly reminders. So I like to think about the conversations with legislators, as we'll continue to point out, they are people. It is not necessary to come, in a hostile way or anything of that nature, but we do have to be solid on our position, and we have to be understanding of, or knowledgeable rather, of what are we actually speaking about, right? We don't just want to be a robot and that we're just repeating what we heard in the sessions earlier that day. How are we really truly understanding what we're advocating for, and then how does that then come out? So a couple things I want to point out here. When we are talking to educators, right, and they say, but we have hope, here's a great response. So I researched, what are the values, the mission of just the Georgia Lottery, right? And it was golden. It was right there. Their literal motto is for the students. So we want to hold their feet to the fire on that, right? So here's a response. So, if you're engaging with the legislator and they say, but we have hope, and you can automatically go into your knowledge of the Hope Scholarship that you've received today. And what I want you to do, so that you don't feel overwhelmed, just take a couple of the digestible pieces that Jesse shared with you, right? It is not a real expectation that you will take all of what you heard today and know it and commit it to memory and be able to, speak on that. It takes some time, right, to really understand. But we just ask you to figure out 1 or 2 stats or pieces that you can provide. And so again, you can say, hey, well, I know that the Georgia Education Lottery is the funding source for the Hope Scholarship, and their motto is for the students. Okay, so let's talk about that. If it is for the students, can we ensure that we have need-based scholarships? Can we ensure that we are using the $706 million in unrestricted reserves for a good reason? And this is how you do so. So this is just one tangible way to say, hey, your motto is, and then you can fill in the blank from there. Another elevator pitch or friendly reminder, if you just have a quick moment with the legislator. Now, these are taken right from their website. The Senate Committee on Higher Education, key issues, they have 4, right? 4 of those, which I have bolded, directly relate to financial aid and college affordability. What I love here, my favorite part about it, is the college affordability, right? That says that we want to ensure that college is accessible and affordable for students. Again, how can we do that? Need-based aid, educational lottery source. And so these are key ways that you can use their language, speak their language, say, hey, I did the research and I found that college affordability and student financial aid are your key issues. Can we talk more about that? Again, number 3, Hope Scholarship and Education Grants. Although we are looking to expand Hope and looking to expand into a need base, but you can talk about briefly how this scholarship, as you know now, started as a need base with a component of merit, right? But certainly a need base, and even the words of Governor Zell Miller, who was very instrumental in pioneering this, said that he wanted to serve minority students who were under-resourced. And again, this is an opportunity to use the language of the values, the mission, the vision that these organizations said that they are about, and we can use the same language to help advocate and hold their feet to the fire. Last couple things I want to point out. These are really important. And again, I say take 1 or 2 stats. Don't get overwhelmed. Again, you can't commit all of this to memory, but the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, which by the way, you can't have a conversation. I was just telling Jesse this in Georgia, talking about need-based aid or anything in terms of advocacy with education policy without having Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. So I highly recommend, if you want to learn more about this subject, to visit their website. So this is a figure from one of their articles, Jennifer Lee, who's a great analyst, who's one of our key players. But I say find that stat that burns your biscuits. So you will hear me say this a lot. What burns your biscuits? To me, what burns my biscuits is the fact that $706 million is sitting in excess, sitting and just gaining interest, when we have students who cannot afford to go to college. So when you look at this figure here, you see that the number of students with Zell, and I want to point out something, this really burns my biscuits. Only 6% of students with the Zell Miller Scholarship are Black. Okay? Only 6% of Hispanic students that have Zell, only 6% of the students who are Hispanic have Zell. And so these are staggering numbers when you look at 70% of white students, right? Again, because this is a merit-based scholarship and it has evolved into that, we see a huge difference. We see this huge disparity. So finding just one of these numbers, and it can be central to the students that you serve. It can just be something, again, that burns your biscuits and you want to speak about, but finding just one of these stats to say, hey, only 21% of the students who receive Hope are Black, only 10% are Hispanic, only 7% are Asian. These numbers matter. So just finding 1 or 2 of these and committing those to memory as you're talking with your legislator is going to be key. Lastly, this is very simple. This is true to who you are and the work that you do. I have a story that I tell of a student who wanted to go to Clayton State University. He was a first-gen student. I checked in with his mom the next school year because he had a brother coming along. And I said, well, how's he doing? And she said, well, he couldn't afford to go to college, so he's working at Five Guys. So every time I tell that story, my mind just goes back to the moment that I learned that we had $706 million. And I have a student who is working at Five Guys who perhaps, through his job may or may not be offering health benefits, may not be on a trajectory for management or leadership, and what may come of his life. Now, there may be some great things that may come, but this student was on track and accepted into college, but unable to matriculate because they did not have the money to go. This is real life here. And so we want to drive home the urgency of need-based aid. We want to let our legislators know that we continue to have this conversation, but we are ready to see a change. And so these personal narratives that you have with your students are going to be key. They are going to bring life to these advocacy points that we are making. So we have just a short time, but would love to take any pressing questions that you have. We've given a lot of information. Again, I would highly recommend just kind of taking it back and picking out the pieces that you think would be helpful in the context of the conversations that you hope to have with your legislator. Something that may connect with you on within the context of your students. So would love to hear any questions if you all have any. Or any thoughts or comments as well.
Actually, I think the one thing that I would add is in my conversations at previous years, Georgia Legislative Day, when you go into those meetings with your legislators, typically you are the expert in the room. You as the school professional, you are the one who is really teaching them something. You have an opportunity there to talk to someone who, yes, may be a legislator, but their field of expertise may be in something completely unrelated to education. You hope, of course, that the people that are on the higher education committee have more experience and perhaps have a better understanding of what's going on. But oftentimes you might be meeting with a legislator who is a first year legislator. They're fresh out of their previous occupation, and they may not be aware of the fact that Georgia has $0 for need-based aid in the state. And their first and gut reaction is going to be to talk about, well, we have the Hope Scholarship. And I think if we can begin to educate people and explain to them that not only do we not have any funding at all for need-based education, but that other states, particularly other southern states, have programs already developed that we can borrow from, that we can copy from, that we can help to replicate in the state to make our students not only stay in Georgia, but better educated and better prepared for the high education jobs that we have available to them in the state. That's going to create additional funding, which is in turn going to just continue to improve funding for the country, for the state, I should say. Looks like we've got some questions coming in now.
All right, and Jesse, I am unable to, oh, I can see them, sorry about that. All right, so hi, Rick. Good morning. It says, do we know what prior conversations the legislature has had around need-based recently? Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, so it's not exactly recent, but in 2018, Georgia did approve the creation of need-based aid. Unfortunately, that basically went in as an unfunded mandate. They created the ability for the Georgia Student Finance Commission to have need-based aid, but they assigned the committee the task of coming up with where the money was going to come from. They basically gave it no money, and then said, you're on your own, go find your own money, and then gave them no power to do so. So to the best of my knowledge, that has been the most recent conversations that we've been able to get off the ground about creating need-based aid. As Ashley has mentioned, we've been in touch with several legislators, both in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, so that we can begin to create these conversations going forward this year about kind of reviving House Bill 787 and giving some teeth to the commission that they created. But I don't think I have any other knowledge since 2018 about this issue.
No, same here. And what I would mention is that's where our key partners come in. I'm happy to check with Jennifer Lee, who is a policy analyst over at Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, who I'm sure could give us a little bit more of a pulse. But I think that's one of the more formal ones that's actually been passed. And Jesse, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but one of the reasons why it wasn't passed, one of the reasons why it did not come to fruition was that it needed the governor's signature and a funding source. I wonder where we can get money to have a need-based aid scholarship. I see one more question here. It says, from Rick, it says, are they aware that we are one of only 2 states without this, or that Vermont's flagship UVM has the highest percentage of non-residents that are than any other nationally? I would guess no. And this is where, as Jesse mentioned, as us being the experts on it, can share with them, because who likes to be last or close to last, and what can we do about that? But no, I don't think that they know. And I think that that is one of the top stats, or facts rather, that stands out to me in this conversation. Jesse, would you add anything before I go to the next question?
No, I think you're right. I think it's, whenever I bring it up with the legislator, they generally are surprised to hear that we are one of the only 2 states without a need-based scholarship. And then to hammer the point home, I generally talk about the fact that we are definitely the only southern state in our surrounding area that has no need-based aid. And that, for whatever reason, seems to resonate with them more. Shame can be a very powerful tool when it comes to these kinds of conversations.
Right. I see one last question from Christina. Good morning. You said, how do you reply to people that say if they can't meet merit requirements, why should they receive money for higher ed? I get this all the time when having this discussion. What are your talking points? I'm just going to immediately jump to conversations that generally most people aren't very comfortable having, right? So essentially, this scholarship, the Hope Scholarship, does not account for past injustices for marginalized communities, right? So if you are a part of a community that has been kept out of building wealth in this country, it is going to be very difficult without receiving trust funds or intergenerational wealth passed down from your line of relatives to be able to afford college. And we know that the cost of college is increasing every single year. And so what we want to point out is that institutions say we want a diverse student body. And one way to ensure that you can have students who are under-resourced is to help give them money to actually attend. So when we think about diversity, under-resourced students, that is a part of diversity, bringing on students who cannot traditionally afford to go to college. Again, when you have a scholarship that is exclusively designed to be a merit-based scholarship, you are excluding students who cannot afford to go to college, right? These are vulnerable populations. And when scholarships do not acknowledge those past injustices, what we see is that a merit-based scholarship can essentially support students who do come from means. And that's why we see that huge disparity there, with white students overwhelming in all categories for Hope and Zell and Hope grants who receive that. So we can talk more about that. I think that is actually a really important question that is very nuanced, but I think that would be my first reaction there. And that is said in a very professional, not so direct way, but I think that's one way that we can have that conversation.
Ashley, all of the points that you made are 100% accurate. I think the other tack that I've taken before in the past is that a better educated populace results in addition, improves the health of the entire state, right? Students that graduate from college typically earn about 68% more in just salary than in income than those who only earn a high school degree. Higher salaries are taxed, and that money is coming back into the state. So in essence, improving education within the state helps build a greater tax base, which helps fund other projects that the state wants to go and do. So aside from just being the right thing to do, this is a way that you can improve the funding that's coming into the state.
Excellent. I see one last question here. It says, do we know why they are holding the 700 million in reserves? Are they anticipating declines in revenues, or is there something else they are earmarking for the money? Very good question. A couple things that come to mind as a response to that is, one, there was a year around 2010, 2011 when the Zell Miller Scholarship was revised, and that there was a standardized test component, and they had to figure out a way when they had less revenue the year before to still give scholarships and not completely do away with the program, but still be able to give scholarships, but fewer. They were able to make some adjustments. And so I think that they're just, from what I can gather, it's just a very fiscally conservative way of going about it, right? But also what I think is happening is that we are not utilizing rather the education lottery for it. We're not optimally utilizing it, essentially, right? So we are sitting on this reserves just for the sake of sitting on it, from what I can gather. I have not heard, and I'm continuing to hear these conversations, right? But I have not heard a legitimate reason why $706 million should sit anywhere in an education lottery reserve. Again, we're not talking about general funds. We're talking about the actual education lottery fund that should be dedicated to education initiatives. And so I have not heard one that would ever make sense to me, for now at least, but from what I can gather, it's just sort of there just in case. I just want to say thank you all so much. Again, we are just your colleagues, right, who have said we want to dedicate more time to holding our legislators' feet to the fire on this issue. And we want to, do as much work as we can advocacy-wise. And so if you are moved or led by this presentation today and would like to learn more about what we're doing and potentially consider joining us, we'd love to have that conversation so we can share our information. But again, we are highly motivated colleagues who are just making a sacrifice to changing the status quo. So thank you so much to our legislative chairs, Emily and Kaylee, for inviting us. We really appreciate this time to share this information with you.
Thank you so much, Jesse and Ashley. That was just tremendously helpful and enlightening to many of us. We look forward to working with you throughout the remainder of the year and seeing the rest of you at Georgia Legislative Day on February 3rd. Thank you all so much for being here and taking the time.